Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
To all who shall see these presents, greetings. On behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brewcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Nate Janikin, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, United States Marine Corps, or any other agency in the United States government. Today's host will be the Krulak Center's own China SME, Mr. Dan Rice, who's been on the Brewcast several times at this point. Dan's been busy since we last spoke with him, recently publishing a China Maritime Studies Institute note on Chinese carrier battle groups, and earlier this year, he published a longer research paper on the People's Liberation Army Navy Coastal Defense Missile Force. Dan, thanks for joining me here on the podcast, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Kiwi. I'm super excited to be here, and especially with Dr. Young, the Dean of McWar, to kick off what should be a really exciting podcast series on China and the People's Liberation Army, the military of the Chinese Communist Party. So before we jump into the topic for today, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Young to give a brief introduction to yourself. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing over at McWar and maybe some background on yourself.
So Kiwi and Dan, thank you for the invite to this inaugural event. It's an honor to take part in this. So first, a little bit about me. I've been a China expert for a couple of decades now, and I have been dean at the Marine Corps War College. This is going on my 6th year, but I try and keep my hand in all things China. I can't obviously be as busy as you, Dan, with China-related analyses and other things, but I try and keep my hand a little bit in some pots and pans on China. What we're doing here at Marine Corps College, I'm trying to educate tomorrow's senior leaders, and both military and civilian. And of course, that involves a number of different activities related to their professional military education, to include China. And so it's my pleasure to be able to take part in this conversation about China, about the Chinese Communist Party, about the People's Liberation Army.
Thank you, Dr. Young. And as you mentioned, this is the inaugural episode of what should become quite a good series. And really the thought process behind it, as you and I have had many conversations in your office, diving into the nitty gritty about China and the PLA, it's really that what we want to do is create a baseline of knowledge, right? So that any Marine or any person in uniform that wants to get up to speed and look at China and look at this problem set has something to kick them off with, and ideally in a format that's easy to consume, right? That's podcasting. So as we dive into this, we're going to be looking at China, kind of the big strategic picture that's behind it, and then looking at the different aspects of grand strategy using a DIME framework, and then doing a little bit more of a deep dive into individual services of the PLA and what their current steady state is and how that's influencing the region. So I'm really excited, Dr. Young, to have you as the first guest on this series and to help us kick it off with some of that big strategic picture and using your experience as the dean and kind of framing this for our audience. So if you don't mind, what I would like to do is to do that right now, right? We've mentioned some things like the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Republic of China, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and a lot of times this turns into like a big alphabet soup. And I know, within our community, we often discuss, when we're talking about China, do we say PRC? Do we say CCP? What are we doing here? So if you wouldn't mind just giving a little bit of clarity into how you see each of those acronyms and what they mean when we're discussing China.
So when you look at great question. So when you look at the PRC, the CCP, and China, 3 different but related concepts. The PRC, the People's Republic of China, the nation state, formed in 1949. So the PRC as an entity is 75 years old. That's how you should look at that, as a political entity. It's a member of the UN Security Council. It's a member of the Family of Nations. It is a nation state. The Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, formed in 1921. It's a political and ideological entity with Marxist-Leninist origins and characteristics. It's ideologically driven. That's a debatable point, but the ideology certainly plays a role in its governance. And it's the single party that governs the Chinese political system. And then when you get to China, it's an ancient civilization, several millennia old, going back pre-Christ, with culture all its own, and with characteristics along with different historical figures marking its history, Confucius, different dynasties. And that's how I would separate those three different entities: PRC, CCP, and China.
All right. So then let me ask you the toughest question, right? When we're discussing China overall, what is the nuance of using each individual term? I know you mentioned and you defined them very, very well for us, but when you read the newspapers or you read an op-ed or you read a book, oftentimes people are like, hey, China is doing this over here, or China is doing that over here. What do you think is the most accurate way to describe that?
So if you're talking about a foreign policy or a specific policy laid out by the government, then I would use the PRC to describe that. If you're talking about the actions, motives, underlying strategy of the leading political entity, then I would use the CCP, who governs China, who's in power. And then if you start talking about sort of cultural characteristics, then I would refer to the Chinese people, Chinese civilization. That's how I would make those three distinctions.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I see it very much in the same way. So now that we've kind of defined what we're talking about in this sphere, when we're talking about China and the different groups and the different meaning behind it, just to pull it back up for a second. So why do you think that making a series on China, the CCP, the PLA today, right now, for the Marines is important? What are some of the things that you're seeing either at McWar or within the community? And really, why is this becoming such a big topic?
Well, that's a great question. So you can cut at that question a number of different ways. So first, in terms of so one of the reasons it's very important is that China's military capabilities, its economic modernization, its growing capabilities as a nation, but primarily because its military capabilities have grown exponentially over the last several decades, 2 decades or so, makes it, to use the official DoD jargon, it makes it the pacing threat to the United States. So when we look at a country grow like that, develop military capabilities that could conceively be utilized to threaten U.S. national security interests or the international system, that really gets our attention. So that's one of the reasons. That is China, the Chinese military has grown and has developed capabilities that could conceivably directly threaten U.S. national security interests, the international system, and basically the stability of the Indo-Pacific. So that's one important reason. Second, the Chinese Communist Party. What are their motives? What is it that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to accomplish over the long run? Is the CCP's ultimate objective to essentially knock the United States off of its privileged perch as the dominant international actor in the international system, or is Chinese Communist Party trying to carve out a space for itself in the international system where it has greater say in what goes on in international affairs, or is China, the Chinese Communist Party, trying to reassert hegemony in the Asia Pacific? So because we are not entirely certain, we don't have a 100%, we do not have 100% certainty as to which of those objectives. That becomes a central question that China watchers, people who specialize in China, think about. Whether any of those three are extremely important for U.S. security policy, U.S. defense policy, and generally to understand the safety and security of the country going into this and to the next century.
So what we're seeing now, and what we've seen, quite frankly, for a couple of decades, is really culminating into, hey, it's written into the NDS now as China's the pacing threat, as you mentioned, right? And now we're seeing a big shift of focus, or at least a lot more writing and talking and thinking about this problem and trying to frame it so that we can better understand it.
Yeah, that's correct. What I would say, yeah, that's absolutely correct. A lot more thinking, a lot more writing, a lot more discussing the importance of China towards our national security, towards international security. And I might add that because we are largely not in consensus, right? There are a lot of people indicate that we are in consensus that China is a challenge to U.S. national security, international security, but the nature of that challenge is still hotly debated. Now, you're probably going to have some guests who show up in these podcasts who will argue with that and will say, no, we are in consensus. I would disagree. I would say that while we all agree that China poses a real challenge to U.S. foreign policy, U.S. national security, we're not in consensus in terms of exactly what that challenge truly is. You're going to have guests who are going to vehemently disagree with me on that, who will say, no, it's clear that China is a threat to the international order. And we're all in consensus. And I would say that that's not the case, that there's still a great debate going on as to the nature of that challenge.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. It is something that, you and I, we spend a lot of time thinking about and trying to frame and discuss, and constantly growing in knowledge and constantly reassessing the situation. So
Yeah.
it's a fascinating field to be in right now.
Oh yeah.
That's for sure. So I want to touch back on something you mentioned a little bit earlier, because now that we understand some of the terms, we understand the rationale behind it a little bit better. And you mentioned that when we're talking about the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, that we're really talking about a political entity and an ideology, right? And so it seems like from my perspective, in order to really set a foundation, a strong foundation on how to look at this problem, we have to understand a little bit more about where the CCP comes from, right? Where does that ideology stem from?
Yep.
So I would ask, if you're up to the task, can you talk to us a little bit about maybe the strategic mindset of the CCP, or how their history and how their formation influences the way that they perceive the world currently? And even if you want to dive into leadership and maybe some shifts in ideology over time, or any nuance that you can provide to us there.
Yep. Great question, Dan. I'll see if I'm up to the task.
I'm sure you are.
Okay, so some basics. Chinese Communist Party formed in Shanghai, 1921, out of a time when Chinese society, civilization, and the political system essentially asking a lot of questions. How could China go from being the center of the universe, from their perspective, as the most important country in the Asia Pacific, to the sick man of Asia, in which the imperialist powers had carved China up? And so you had a really robust intellectual dynamic going on, where people were asking these types of questions. What should China borrow from the West or outside of China in order to fix this problem? Out of this So what else is going on? The end of World War I is taking place. The last dynasty, Qing dynasty, is collapsing, and at the end of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles leads to some agreements in which Japan is given bits and pieces of China, which upset the Chinese people greatly. And out of this is born the May 4th protest by students, and out of that comes this extremely powerful revolutionary spirit that comes out. Several of the Chinese Communist Party leaders that we're all familiar with, Deng Xiaoping and others, were students, young participants in this May 4th movement. Out of this comes the creation of the Chinese Communist Party, which had a lot of appeal to young Chinese and even mature Chinese. So it was an ideology or an idea that was anti-imperialist, had formulas for good governance, formulas for how to launch a revolution to overturn the imperialist powers and capitalist powers. And so the Chinese Communist Party is born out of this revolutionary fervor, mixed in with a nationalistic fervor to expel the imperialist powers, to expel warlords who are dominating the country at the time, to make China into a modern, powerful nation state, and then to also pick up the ideology being put forth by the recently developed Soviet Union, who had just had its revolution in 1917. So this is what the Communist Party was born out of in 1921. The eventual consolidation of that power and the eventual expelling of both the imperialist powers and the nationalists, the national party that was opposing the communists, ultimately led to the People's Republic of China being formed in 1949. So you have this birth of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. You have a successfully fought civil war, a successfully fought anti-Japanese conflict, and then you have the creation of the People's Republic of China. So by the early 1950s, you have a nation state born out of, largely founded around the Chinese Communist Party, which was born out of a revolutionary spirit. And so between 1950 and 1980, you had a Communist Party under the rulership of Mao Zedong and those initial Civil War leaders essentially running the country. The formation of government continued to be dominated by a single party, the Chinese Communist Party, continued to be dominated by a Leninist, Marxist-Leninist oriented Communist Party. And that has characterized the Chinese Communist Party to today. That is a Communist Party that was largely created out of a revolutionary spirit. Now we can start getting into modern Chinese history. So for example, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but between 1950 and 1980 or 1976, you had a number of really searing internal political and economic events like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, where the Chinese Communist Party made disastrous decisions leading to deaths of tens of millions of people, and then ultimately of Deng Xiaoping then taking the mantle of leadership by 1978 from Mao Zedong, and then deciding that he was going to try and open China up to the West. But still in the middle of this, China was being run by the Chinese Communist Party, born of a revolutionary spirit and still Leninist in character. So I'll leave it at that. We can talk about those specifics, but I think that gives a rough outline of the Chinese Communist Party's history in the 20th century.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think maybe it's a Mao Zedong quote, but we have stood up in 1949. Yep. Right? It gives a lot of background to him standing on the stage, making that statement and establishing the country, right? The PRC. And also, I want to tease this out because you mentioned the Nationalist Party, right, in the Civil War.
Yeah.
And so when we say Nationalist Party, we're really talking about the KMT, right, the Kuomintang, who ends up becoming the leading party of Taiwan for a few decades after this 1949, after they've been repulsed back there, right?
That's right. That's right. So, just now that you brought it up, a little bit more detail on that. So, the beginning of the, so I sort of framed it as in the Chinese were looking for answers to their decline. The other answer that they were coming up with was the formation of the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, right? So you have these two competing ideas at the beginning of the 20th century, communism and then the Nationalist Party. Then to complicate this picture, both parties turned to the Soviet Union as, hey, you're a country that has successfully fought off imperialist powers. What do you suggest? And Stalin and the Communist Internationale said, what I would suggest you do is you form an alliance. So there's a complicated history between the nationalists and the communists. Sometimes they're allied, sometimes they're fighting one another in a civil war. They then get back together again to both fight against Japan. The war with Japan is over. The United States tries to negotiate a settlement or a deal between the Communist Party and the Nationalists. That falls through. Then they re-engage in a civil war in the late 1940s, and then ultimately the PLA and the Chinese Communist Party prevail over the Nationalists, forcing Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalists to flee and go over to Taiwan, where to today we still are in a standstill.
Yeah, I've heard some folks in the community call it a frozen conflict, right? It's still a battle of ideologies between the two. And, putting it in that framework, it makes a lot of sense as to why still to this day, in the 2019 white paper that the CCP put out on national security, Taiwan is still ranked as its top issue, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, that was an excellent overview of the history. And so I do want to tease out a little bit more. You mentioned Mao Zedong, you mentioned the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. You touched on Deng Xiaoping. He comes to power after Mao's death, and he took a bit of a different tact, right, in terms of how he saw China and the Chinese Communist Party moving into the future. So, you don't have to dive too deep in the weeds on this, but can you talk to us a little bit about how from Mao to Deng ideology slightly shifted, and did we see that happen again in the future? Is this something, often we think CCP and we think, oh, that long-term 100-year strategy or whatever long-term strategy, does the ideology change and does the strategy change over time?
Great question, and a very nuanced question. So I'll answer it this way. So Mao decides by the early 1960s that so wait, let me back up. He decides to launch what's called the Great Leap Forward, which is a highly radical idea, which is to enhance China's economic modernization by essentially creating collectivized farms out in the countryside, almost to the extent of eliminating the family as an actual economic unit, combining families, putting them in collective housing, and having them engage in collectivized farming. To have those farms then produce, and then the produce, they got rewarded not to each family member, but to the production brigade commander, who would then distribute to each family member what, I guess I forget the Chinese term, each to his needs, etc.
Yeah, they had meal tickets, right? I have a couple of those meal tickets.
That's correct. That's about as radical. So when people talk about communism, that's about as close as you can get to actual communism.
Right.
So what also happens during this time is, as we all know about China, is that the leaders at the top are now expecting reports. How is production going? And what starts happening is people at the bottom are inflating the production figures so that the people at the top start thinking that this is a huge success, but in reality, they're not producing as much as they think they are. They are not producing as much as the leadership at the top are thinking they are. And ultimately, in the end, over the course of a couple of years, you start developing food shortages and ultimately starvation. And so up to the point that by close to the end of the Great Leap Forward, you have tens of millions of Chinese dying of starvation. All right, so this disaster leads to Mao sort of backing off from day-to-day leadership of the party and putting the day-to-day management of the party in the hands of Deng Xiaoping and then another character who I have not brought up yet, Liu Shaoqi. Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping decide that the right approach is to experiment with certain economic ideas that will foster economic development while still maintaining a degree of control over the means of production by the party. Mao, in the meantime, does not like this idea, and ultimately he decides by the early to mid 1960s to turn on the party. He then launches what then is called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, in which he encouraged the youth to essentially attack members of the party, thereby leading to great amount of chaos in China. Deng Xiaoping becomes a victim of this event. He's essentially stripped of his responsibilities and his powers, and he's then sent down to the countryside. Liu Shaoqi also, but unfortunately for him, he dies under house arrest. So Deng Xiaoping comes out of this experience being completely scarred by the experience of a single consolidated power of a single individual within the Chinese Communist Party system. So he sees the problem with having too much power in a single individual. So when he ultimately ascends to the party leadership, and that's an entire another story, how you could go from being sent all the way down to the countryside and then brought back up to be the top leader again is an entirely different story, which you don't have time for. But upon assuming leadership, he decides that he's going to reform the political system. And part of that reform, I'll try and summarize this up in a few seconds because I know your podcast doesn't have unlimited time. So his ideas are open up to the West, reform the political system, and put in place a consensus-oriented decision-making political system in which the leadership at the top has to make decisions by consensus. Put in term limits, 2 consecutive 5-year terms for the general secretary of the party. Have age limits. You can't be older than 68, I believe, and then you age out. As a result of this, you then are able to, if everyone knows that after 10 years you're going to have a new leader, that then fosters the idea that the Chinese Communist Party members will negotiate and bargain with each other to put people into places of power. They will work with one another to create a succession system in which they can all live with. That's the system that Deng Xiaoping put in place, and between 1978 and 2012, that was essentially the system they had. That's a system that allowed for unprecedented economic growth and stability in the People's Republic of China. But of course, that then comes to an end with the next general secretary of the party who comes in 2012.
And I was gonna say, when you discuss Mao Zedong, sometimes you'll hear him referred to as a great revolutionary or the great helmsman of the revolution, right? And then when you think about Deng Xiaoping, a lot of folks will refer to him in Chinese as the father of modern China and the driver of economic reform and reforms overall. So there is some shift there, right? And like quite a tangible one in terms of the CCP assessing the situation and then somebody rising to power with their own thoughts on how to move forward and then adopting those and really inculcating the CCP writ large on, hey, this is the way we want to do this. And there's got to be some sort of difficulty in doing that, right? In terms of, if you have one mental model of viewing the world and crafting strategy, there's got to be dissidence. Do we see that pop up with specifically with the transition between Mao and Deng?
So let me. Are you saying there was a different perspective of worldview between Mao and Deng, and therefore it therefore led to a different strategy being formulated by the two?
Yeah, a different angle of attack, so to speak, right? And when Deng Xiaoping came to power and he started implementing the economic reforms, that was radically different than the revolutionary Marxist-Leninist spirit, right? Was there pushback on that? Was there a transition? Was this an easy?
Okay.
Go ahead.
I got you. I lost the bubble there for a second, but so Mao largely prided himself on being an advanced ideological theoretician, constantly obsessed with bringing about the arrival of a socialist state through continuous revolution, right? So his viewpoint was, right, you don't rest on your laurels. You don't get to a communist state by essentially creating a stable governing body. That's not how you get to true communism. So he was constantly thinking about struggle, internal struggle, making sure people weren't complacent. His worst fears were socialist revisionism, that is backsliding of the Communist Party, and so he was obsessed with that. So the main reason he essentially ended up attacking the party and attacking Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi was he was convinced that the Chinese Communist Party was backsliding and becoming a revisionist party. He had good reason, right? So he was looking at the Soviet Union. Post-Stalin appeared to be backsliding themselves. The Soviet Union invading other socialist countries under the Brezhnev doctrine. If they see a socialist country who they disagreed with, felt was not acting like a true socialist country, that they reserved the right to invade that country. It happened in Hungary. It happened in Czechoslovakia. So Mao had this perspective that he had to fight revisionism first and foremost in order to bring about and be true to the revolution. Deng Xiaoping, completely different perspective on that. Now, while Deng was a tried and true communist, as we see later on in with the Tiananmen Square decisions, right, in Tiananmen Square, he had a different approach to management of the communist state. He was a pragmatist. He always felt that there had to be a compromise between economic modernization and bringing about a socialist state. But he was always had in mind, you need to have a strong material base in order to encourage the people to bring about and accept communism. So Deng, of course, the most famous phrase from Deng, it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice, perfectly captures the Deng Xiaoping spirit. That is, he was a pragmatist. He was constantly saying, all right, let's think about what works, but always within the framework of a Leninist communist state. And therefore his view was to incorporate ideas which would open China up, encourage economic modernization, but can keep it within the framework of under the leadership of the Communist Party. But he would downplay continuous revolution, and in addition, he would experiment with things like, let's relinquish some of the party's control over some governance activities, right? Give more responsibilities to the state or the government, and let the party back off. Give some room for the government, and let the party be the strategizer. Whereas Mao had a completely different idea. Mao's belief was the party needed to be in everything, had to largely control everything, and largely had to be completely aware of what was going on to the best of its ability and limits of technology at the time. and Deng Xiaoping just had simply had a different view of that. Now, you asked the question, was there pushback? Yes. Obviously, you're going to have a large number of party cadres who did not agree with Deng Xiaoping. And so Deng Xiaoping had to spend a number of years in power struggles before he could feel that his power had been consolidated, that he had people in place who he could trust, his loyalists were in place, and so therefore he could then pursue his program. But he had a relatively, I'm not going to say a lengthy, because it wasn't a lengthy power struggle. He had at least a 2 or 3 year power struggle with those individuals who were either of the leftist bent or those who were sort of who are not necessarily ultra leftists, but were certainly not open to some of Deng's ideas about opening up China.
Yeah, and when we're talking Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, and oftentimes looking through CCP writings and the way they talk about them, Deng was so successful that he became enshrined as one of those core leaders, right? That core ideological leader, as well as Mao, right? Mao is the original. Deng comes on, he gains that support, becomes a core leader, and we've got a couple successors to Deng who didn't quite meet the mark of the core leader, but they had their own place in time. We're talking about Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao. And then we move into the next, who has been identified as a core leader, which brings us right into modern times, Xi Jinping, right?
Yeah.
And so, from this concept of having that core ideological leader, and we've moved now into this modern time, what kind of things do you see from Xi Jinping that might be reflected in history, or that might be influenced by that history that you just walked us through, right? When we're talking different ideologies for different times, so there's some characteristics of Xi Jinping that we see that either mirror or differentiate from some of the past.
Yeah. So I think I find it helpful to look at the Communist Party's history as a dynamic that swings from a single dominated paramount leader to a collective oligarchy, consensus-oriented oligarchy, and then which swings back and forth. For whatever reason, in the Hu Jintao era, which was very consensus-oriented, the basic consensus, at least amongst China watchers, is that time frame was lackluster.
Right.
Too many cooks, cooking the stew. That Hu essentially was unable to consolidate power, and therefore the state and the party was essentially adrift, unable to really take decisive action on a number of really big problems. Some of it being inequality, societal inequality, corruption, different parts of the bureaucracy growing too fat. And then even individual agencies taking action without necessarily the party center being fully aware of what was going on. So the perception, both inside and outside of China, was that party members felt that they needed to fix that problem, and so they elected what they thought was someone who could take decisive action, Xi Jinping. What they didn't realize, and I guess this is hotly contested, how much they knew or how much they didn't know. What they didn't realize was that they were putting in place a general secretary who would so drastically swing the Chinese Communist Party system back to into such a consolidated, authoritarian, paramount leader on the of the likes of Mao, right? So it's hard to say whether or not in selecting him in 2012, whether the Chinese Communist Party elite realized what they were getting, but that's what they ended up getting. They ended up getting Xi Jinping, who essentially has run roughshod over some of the consensus-oriented norms that Deng Xiaoping put in place, right? So he violates the two-term general secretary rule.
Right.
He's repeatedly violated, for the people that he's put in place in power, he's repeatedly violated age limits, including for himself, right? I believe he himself has exceeded that age limit. So Xi Jinping, additionally, Deng Xiaoping put a consensus-oriented norm to govern the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the highest strategic policy-making body in the Chinese Communist Party. Xi Jinping essentially put in place by becoming the core of the party. Essentially, he is evaluating all the other leaders. To put it in military parlance, he is writing the fit reps of the other Politburo Standing Committee members. If that's the case, how much consensus are you actually get? Obviously you're going to get consensus. You just do what the boss says. Right?
Right.
Nobody's going to stand in Xi Jinping's way. So the way I would look at it is that Xi Jinping has swung the pendulum all the way back to a time when Mao was essentially in charge, to include the launching of mass campaigns. All right, mass campaigns is a hallmark of Mao's governance. We can go back and pull out the history books and talk about the anti-rioters campaign, the 100 Flowers campaign, etc.
Right.
Xi Jinping is all over that. So yes, we've swung all the way back to a time when Mao essentially dominated, and here we are. The great irony is that Deng Xiaoping was trying to create a system that would create stability, consensus-oriented decision-making, and he accidentally ends up creating a situation where you have a consolidated position of power back in place.
All right, that's the great irony of it all, right? The good intentions ultimately didn't pan out.
That's correct. Now, one other note just on this point is that while Deng Xiaoping created this consensus-oriented decision-making process, there's lots of evidence that he himself violated those norms too, right? So look at the Tiananmen Square incident, right? Deng Xiaoping created a Politburo Standing Committee and said, Zhao Ziyang and you guys go run it. And then he put in place a poison pill himself, right? For those of you non-China watchers, I can see that Dan is enjoying this because I'm like using a lot of terminology, right? He puts a poison pill. What do I mean by that? He has a secret agreement with the Politburo Standing Committee that any type of decision that ultimately has an effect on the party and on China requires that they confer with him again. So he tries to create this consensus-oriented decision-making process. He should then have stepped out and said, all right, I now have created this process. I can now retire and rest easily. But instead, Deng just couldn't resist. He had to then intervene as the great paramount leader. So there were even elements under Deng Xiaoping in which the personalistic, dominant, dictator-oriented leader still had his fingerprints all over the system. And therefore, that DNA transferred forward all the way to the present. And you could almost argue that Deng Xiaoping shot himself in the foot by not just creating these norms and then letting enough alone. He had to intervene one last time, leading to the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989.
Yeah, thank you. And it's been a fascinating conversation. I'm aware we're running a little bit short on time now, but I think that was a fantastic overview of really the mindset and the leadership in the CCP, how it has evolved, some of the pushback here and there, and then setting us up for what we're seeing right now. So I would throw one more question your way, which is if you have any advice to people or a piece of advice that you want to give to people that want to get smarter on China, whether it be a book or a other podcast or other resource that you'd point them to, which would be your favorite one to point them to?
Well, I mean, obviously I can't just throw out one book.
That's fair.
That'll suffice. I mean, China is such a complex. So if the question is, do you want to understand the PLA, what's going on with the PLA and modernization, I would highly recommend some of the work that National Defense University has recently done. So Chairman Xi remakes the PLA is like the classic that all of us refer to with regard to joint military reform. If you are interested in reading sort of what's going on in China, the who's who, what's the future of the Chinese Communist Party political system, I would recommend two books, Susan Shirk's Overreach and Elizabeth Economy's The Third Revolution are two very good books. They don't necessarily 100% agree with one another, but they are very good books that sort of do a deep dive into China to try and understand what's going on inside. And then finally, there's another one which I find fascinating and which is really under-examined is Min-Chin Pei's The Sentinel State, which is all about the Chinese surveillance system within China. What you will get out of that book is the idea that the Communist Party is so obsessed with its own survival that it spies on its own people, it spies on foreigners, but most importantly, it spies on itself. It spies on other elites. And if you've got such a system that's so obsessed with surveillance of yourself, when you examine or try and think about Chinese strategy or the threat China poses to the international system, it has to be sort of balanced with the amount of time, effort, expenses that they put into observing and obsessing over themselves, right? So if they're going to be doing things outside of China, setting up bases, being aggressive, that you have to take into account the fact that they're so paranoid and looking at its own house that has to be incorporated with any threat assessment of where China is going. And so I would suggest the Sentinel State is another good book to take a look at.
All right. Thank you so much. Excellent recommendations. So that's all the time that we have for today. But I want to say, Dr. Young, thank you so much for being here with us. Your insights are invaluable, and I know you're a busy man, so taking the time to join us today has been excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today.
And for our audience that's listening, as we move forward, we'll be exploring more topics, going into some of the DIME aspects, and then deep diving into the PLA, bringing more experts like Dr. Young, who are extremely knowledgeable in the field, and hopefully we'll be able to give you a nice holistic picture for you to make your own assessments of what's going on and to learn more about this topic. So thank you for joining us on today's podcast, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Also, thanks to you folks who are joining us in the future on YouTube and Spotify. That's all we have for this episode, so go ahead and carry out the plan of the day. Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you have enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.